Great. Thank you for joining us. The Columbian's editorial board is pleased to welcome Jaime Herrera Beutler, candidate for Commissioner of Public Lands. And we are still trying to connect with the other candidate, Dave Upthegrove. If we do meet with him, we will interview him as well. But for now, we're happy to have Jaime. I'm Greg Jane. I'm the editorial page editor at the Columbian. And I'll let the other editorial board members introduce themselves.
I'm Ben Campbell. I'm publisher and co-owner of the Columbian.
Hi, I'm Colleen Keller. I'm assistant news editor of the Columbian and a member of the editorial board.
And I'm Craig Brown, the editor of the Columbian and Columbian.com.
Let's see. Oh, and one other housekeeping thing. We are recording this. We will post it unedited on our website and YouTube channel for the benefit of our readers. And with that, we'll move on to the candidate. Jaime, why don't you take just 1 to 2 minutes, introduce yourself, explain why you are running for this position, and then we'll move on to specific policy questions. So thanks again.
Sounds good. Well, it's good to be here. And, I am running for Commissioner of Public Lands here in Washington State. I'm super excited about it. So my husband and I are raising our kiddos in what your readers will know is the path of the Yakult burn, which stood for over 100 years as the worst forest fire in Washington State history. But in just the last decade, that record has been surpassed 3 times. So too many of our forests are undermanaged or outright neglected, and they're turning into crowded disease tinderboxes that are waiting for a spark. I think the fire season that's upon us every year, they're running rampant and they're emitting carbon and they're choking us with smoke. They're making home insurance here more unaffordable. If you can get it, which is still something we can still get. And so I just really decided I'm not going to leave my kiddos a legacy of burning forests and choking smoke. And that's why I'm running. I think we can do better. I think we can learn from some of the mistakes on the federal lands. I think we can create an actual firewall in the West by using the most amazing resource that we have, which are our forests. They are carbon storage workhorses. And I am super excited. Honestly, just about this job is one of the most important executive positions that very few people in the state have ever heard of, right? It manages a 2,000 person agency with 6 regional offices and 3 aquatics offices. And the whole purpose is to return value to the people of state of Washington and protect their public land. It is. And so as I looked at this, I just really felt like there's nothing but work, there's a ton of work to do. It is a little separate from partisan offices, which I honestly think is refreshing. And I think that it also really marries the goal of protection and sustainability with utilizing our resources. And I'm sure we'll get into lots of questions about it, but just the idea that it's not either or, it's not either the environment or the economy, but that they can work together and really produce benefit in a sustainable way is something I'm excited to leave to my kids. So that's why I jumped into this race. And it's been an amazing experience.
Great, thank you, and thanks again for joining us. Let's start out talking about wildfires, which you mentioned, and you have focused much of your campaign on that. Do you see it as more a matter of prevention or suppression, and how do you balance those two?
I mean, I think it has to be both, right? So I just got off the news interview with an Eastern Washington station, and they obviously are a lot more familiar with life and property fires that are upon them every summer, right? They know the fire season, they know what's happening. On the wet side, which is where we are, it's a little bit more it's a little bit removed, although I think it's coming, right? For the first time in recorded history, there were more fires in Western Washington than in Eastern Washington last year. So it's not that we'll be able to walk away from this. I think that some of it, whether you're using prescribed burning, which tribes have used for time immemorial, or you're implementing that in your forest health plan, it's a little of both. I believe in fighting fires, but if you're going to use prescribed burning as a tool in your silviculture work, that's also something that you need to use. I was talking with, there's a couple different tribes in Eastern Washington who were like, yeah, of course you do that. That manage their own timberland, like the Yakima, the Kalispel. They know that you prescribe burning is a piece of it, but sustainable harvest is also a piece of it. And so it's not either or. I think they can go really well together.
So would you, to what extent would you advocate for increasing the harvest?
I'm not. Which just sounds so funny. People immediately are like, you just must want to run it through the roof. I'm actually not. I have the boring distinction of being for the current plan, which does, but it's a beautiful plan if you take the time to dig into it. And it's a little wonky, but the habitat conservation plan that was set in place between federal and state biologists in our state, and particularly on the west side, has about 800,000 acres, or more than half of the trust land is permanently set aside. Conservation, habitat, old growth, that's done. And that's part of the plan. There's about 49% that's left. And the plan for that 49% is sustainable forestry. It's harvest over time in different places. We are not hitting that piece. And that's probably the biggest distinction between, my opponent and myself, is he wants to further take land out of that piece. I don't. But that's already set. That's already part of the plan. And in that plan, the goal is you're growing old growth, you're maintaining habitat, you're creating habitat on the land that you will eventually harvest in certain areas, right? So it's all part of the plan. But my goal would be just to hit the plan, which we're not doing. And part of the challenge, there's so many challenges downstream from that, that I'm sure we can get into. But yeah, I'm kind of the stick with where the current biologists, geologists, hydrologists, foresters at DNR have come to agree with the feds on. And that doesn't mean that it can't change or evolve as things, we get more information. But in general, you would see under me as commissioner us hit that plan.
Great, thank you. Craig?
Sure, I'm going to ask a very local question. So, Department of Corrections closed the large correction center, much to the dismay of the DNR. So, I know that there were some things put in place. We didn't have a big fire down here in Southwest Washington this summer that the DNR was the primary on. So, is there enough fire protection on state lands in this part of the state, or do we need to do more?
I don't think there is. As someone who lives in Yakult and looking, if you ever driven through that land, you do, and it's so close to the federal land, which is probably, if you have to put them in a line, that's the worst. But no, I would absolutely like to explore, because that made so much sense for so many reasons. It was fire suppression and protection, but it was also, it's not like those needs for folks who were there went away either. And I'm just seeing the benefit of getting into like a career was also amazing. So that one to me really frustrated me. I think it was the wrong move. I would like to explore what we have to do, when the Cascade Crest is starting to look a little bit more like Central and Eastern Washington. And that's the reality. Like, things are getting warmer. It is changing. We are going to have to deal with this. And so to move our firefighting quick response group out of Yakult and move it to the other side of I-5 up the road, it didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Craig, can you follow up?
No, thank you. I appreciate that.
What do you think of some of the moves that DNR has been making to make some little parcels of land available to be turned into affordable housing? Is that something that you support? Would you continue, or do you have a different view entirely?
I would. Here's why. So what I wouldn't support is converting agricultural land or small forest land or, DNR trust land, that is really productive. I wouldn't want to convert that, but that's not what DNR is talking about doing. In fact, I met with a lawmaker in Eastern Washington who, it was her bill that opened up the door for some of that, where there is land that's like encumbered and inside an urban growth boundary that's not being used to return a resource benefit. It's not habitat. It's not producing timber, grazing opportunity. It's not going to return anything. Her big plan, and I think it's a good one, she got it through, she, as a Republican, she got it through a Dem legislature that would bring tax breaks to people who would develop that if it became affordable housing. And that makes a ton of sense to me. Although, and I would absolutely support that. And those are the criteria. I guess I'll wait till the next one. I'm sure it'll come up in another question, but I think the guts of this agency, the purpose of it is to sustainably manage our state lands for benefit to the trust and in sustainability. And I think the big crux of this race, as I've been going through, I mean, we've done like 8 debates slash forums. So we could give each other's talking points, but I think the big crux here is, are we going to continue to sustainably manage it with science, a science-backed approach, or are we going to become more like a parks department or another department? And I do want to maintain that the purpose of DNR is to do that. Even though I absolutely support, like, it makes so much sense if there's, land that is in the middle of the urban growth boundaries, not doing anything else. Let's turn it to affordable housing. That's a huge need across our state.
Right, for instance, they just did in Pierce County, it was like a 4-acre parcel that again had been determined that had no real value
Yes,
where timber, et
makes
cetera, was
sense.
concerned.
It's
Yeah.
happening in Central Washington. I've seen it in the Tri-Cities. Like, it's literally not going to, you can't do the traditional DNR, activities on it. And housing will continue to be an issue. Another area where this department can impact housing is in the wildland urban interface or interchange, and it does the mapping on that. And I think, which has been controversial, right? Because insurers can look at that mapping and say, we're not gonna insure anybody in that area, which to me is a big problem. But one of the ways I think DNR can approach that, and it's through working with the fire marshal and the insurance commissioner, but also to make sure that where there is that interface and that interchange, that we are really training our forest health and maintenance work on those parcels to reduce the impact, or even the incidence of catastrophic fires in those areas. And I think that's another huge piece of the housing. That's something DNR can do to help with the housing cost of housing and affordability of insurance in Washington. And I think it needs to attack that a little bit more aggressive, and also just to make sure that interchange and that fire zoning, that mapping is done correctly. They haven't done it right everywhere, and I would task DNR pretty quickly with making sure that those maps are accurate. They do reflect the worst of fire hazards, but then I would also pretty aggressively, again, if it's in the set asides, the work is a little different, but if it isn't, we want to make sure that we're reducing the catastrophic fire burden there to protect homes, because we're just going to see more of it. We're certainly going to see more of it in Western Washington, unfortunately.
Thanks.
Ben?
Yes. Jamie, what is your long-term vision for public lands in Washington State?
Thanks for
Maybe
this.
in 20 years, what do you see it?
Oh man, I want us to continue to be the evergreen state. I want to make sure that the forests and the rivers and the streams that all depend on healthy forests, right, continue to be like some of the best in the nation and in the world. I think that this race is going to signal, and let me say, this is going to signal either a one, like we're at a fork in the road. We're going to go this way or we're going to go this way. And I will give our current commissioner a lot of credit. And I know there's always something to pick on with an elected official and what they didn't do right. But she is the first in a few cycles of different commissioners who has both fought the fire piece and got funding in place for that, but has aggressively leaned into the forest health work. And what do I mean by that? So it's not just fighting fires. It's making sure that the fires are ready to handle natural burns and they're not going to serve as tinder for catastrophic burns. And in Eastern Washington, they're about halfway to their goal, which was a 20-year goal, and they've done it in 7 years. But again, there's, I think, a little bit more, political will to do that in Eastern Washington because they live with it more than we do, at least to date. But in Western Washington, we have to I think we need to apply that same coalition that she's built and get that work happening in Western Washington. And right now, again, not talking about the old growth, not talking about the 50+% that's set aside, but on the 49% that was scheduled to be harvested in a sustainable way, we have to complete that work. If we don't complete that work, we are going to see more catastrophic fires. We're going to lose more habitat, and we're already losing the revenue to schools or police or fire. I mean, I could show you a couple letters that I've gotten from the DNR from a school district, a timber impacted school district in Bellingham, Whatcom County. They used to get about 1.2 million a year in timber revenue off the sustainable piece. And I'll talk about how we do that. We actually set the world standard for how we do our any kind of harvest. It is the Sierra Club calls it the gold standard, like how we do it. So it's very pristine. Like we check a lot of boxes on purpose because that's just a value we have. But this school district was supposed to get about a million too. They're at 107,000 this year. And they literally were begging DNR, like, we're under conservatorship with OSPI. I've cut 23 teachers. We've increased class sizes. Like, there's nothing else we can't do to that won't further harm the students, was their language. And so I want to make sure that we do the forest health work so that the forests will continue to be carbon sinks and not carbon emitters, but also because we can do justice to some of these rural communities who were promised and who by law have a benefit here to get. And I think long term, so the immediate is I want to make sure that our forests are going to be here for my kids and my grandkids. And that means supporting those rural communities. But long term, we need this. We need to prove this in the West. The West is on fire. Like in Oregon right now, they're battling their habitat conservation plans and what they're going to do for set-asides and what they're not going to do. In California, 75% of the owl's habitat has burned in California. So it's not an issue of do we set aside and maintain the status quo or not. We actually need to get in there, and whether you're doing thinning work or harvest work, you're creating a more resilient forest. We know that those are like the IPCC. They are the climate experts at the UN, has said, like, using these high standards of forestry, sustainably managing over time, not destroying everything, but using a 7th generation like vision for it, sustainably managing it, and then using those built wood products near that source is like one of the best things you can do to fight climate change. I was looking at the California has a cap and trade system, and they evaluate their forests every year. They do an annual forest health assessment, and I could probably send it to you, but they have a great graph about how the healthy forests sequester the most carbon, and they do it well. And the older forests are the ones that emit. And sequestering or emitting it's a value proposition that we have to make, right? We in Washington State have said we're going to set aside a certain amount for the benefit of habitat. Maybe it doesn't help with carbon sequestration, but it helps with habitat. I believe in that. I think there are trade-offs. But when you look at this piece that should be managed, I want to prove in the West that we should be managing it because it's going to help us fight fires and it's going to help us protect habitat, and it will support these rural economies. And proving that it's not either or for me is the big picture vision of this office. Like, we have the ability to prove that what we do works and how we do it is better. We would import in Washington, and even in just across the nation, we import like 30 to 60% of our wood products, which is a lot. It makes sense to be not importing them from places that may or may not have great environmental standards, to be using them and sustaining them over time. And the fun thing for me has been seeing how many tribes who have resources, like, this is what they do. They're like, yeah, sometimes you got to burn, sometimes you got to harvest, and that harvest is good. And it's making your forest resilient. And they look at me like, what, that's a problem? And I'm like, oh, I don't think it is, but I feel like we're trying to overcome a very old, the owl wars and the feelings that everybody had 40 years ago about that. I feel like we're trying to overcome. We did what we could at the time with the science we had, but now we have, I think our science and our understanding of it has evolved. I'm going to keep with that.
A couple of things I want to follow up there that you mentioned. One, a big part of the DNR is to raise revenue. Would you do anything differently? And as you mentioned, a lot of that goes to schools. Would you do anything differently in that regard?
I mean, what I don't want to change is, the mission of the agency. It is a land management agency, right? It's akin to like a Fortune 500 company. Like it is a portfolio manager. But within that, yeah, I'm open to ideas that give us the best bang for our buck, so to speak. If it's helping us with climate, if our climate goals, it's keeping the rural communities whole, and it doesn't endanger the health of the habitat or the forests, I'm not opposed to new ideas, but one of the strengths of this agency is that it what it knows to do, if it's not hobbled, pulled aside by political interests, which can happen, but it like we know that for that the really well managed DNR trust lands, they sequester over 11 metric tons of carbon per acre. So I will use that as a bar, like, okay, show me that it's going to do, I don't want to do something else that's less of a return. But yeah, I am open because if the science evolves, I
You know,
think it has over time.
as part of that,
Go ahead.
as part of that fundraising or revenue raising mission, the DNR has leased out lands for, say, wineries
Yeah.
and wind farms.
Yep.
Is that a valid use of public lands, and would you look to expand that?
I would, so because those are in different places with different habit topographies, and they do a good job. The pier in Seattle is DNR lease land. The Edgewater in Seattle is on DNR land, and that is revenue coming back to the trust and to the state. So I was cracking up because the Costco in Issaquah, that's all DNR land. So yes, absolutely. But it makes sense in those areas. I wouldn't want to take something that was the most productive for grazing land or for growing grapes and try and, switch missions with it if it wasn't going to return as much of a benefit. So I guess I'd be looking at it in a investment in a return. But absolutely, the diversity of the lands managed by the Commissioner for the People of Washington is incredible. It's just amazing to me. And we haven't even talked about the aquatics offices and the tidelands there, but there's a lot of, we talk about forests, but it's not all forests. That's just the thing that I think most people identify with.
And then, in fact, how much revenue does the DNR raise in a typical year?
So that I can't quite give it. It's not apples to apples. I can tell you, DNR trust land will generate, it's billions in 10 years. I can give you a rough 10-year number and say it's billion, multiple billions, right? Give or take based on how you break it up. The commercial lands return, the aquatic lands return, but here's the thing. DNR is not just a trust land manager, it is also a regulator. So it regulates private forest timberlands. You're not going to be making money regulating, right? The area where I think there's an opportunity to return to a more sustainable revenue source is on the trust lands. If you get that money going, and I've worked on this at the federal level, we could get that money that comes from a timber harvest in a certain piece of land, and that money it's going to hit its county responsibilities and its school responsibilities. But I'd like to see that go back into the silviculture work, not send it into a black hole in Olympia, and to further develop it. And that's what I think we have an opportunity to create more of a revolving fund. You're never going to create that in the regulatory world because you're not producing anything, right? You're really not creating anything. You're a lease manager. So they're not apples to apples like the whole DNR creates this, because there's also,
Okay,
you're going to spend money.
sure. Craig?
Sure. You and your challenger, like you said, have had several chances to debate or be at public forums together. What would you say are the major differences between the two of you?
I'm the only, and this group's going to laugh at this just because you guys you've interviewed me before over the years. I'm the only candidate in this race who's actually bipartisan, who's worked across the aisle or with people groups that you don't agree with. I was challenging him at one of them in the last week. He's like, I'm the moderate, I'm the bipartisan. I was like, what? You're completely owned by extreme environmental groups. That is it. That's the only people you even talk to. You don't even respond to people who don't who question you. Whereas I've sat down with conservation groups. I've been endorsed by tribes and tribal leaders in this race. I've been endorsed by unions in this race. And I was like, give me one group that is slightly Republican aligned, just one. Just give me one person that has supported you in this race. And he was like, meh. So I think that matters. This shouldn't be a partisan race. It really shouldn't. But that has been an increasing attack that he's used, especially in the Seattle area. He's like, Republican, Republican, Republican. And I'm like, yeah, yes. Why is that? We don't have one Republican elected statewide. A little bit of balance isn't going to hurt anybody. But then the other thing I think is really just a functional difference. And I was just reading from a DNR employee who just posted, I don't know her, posted on Facebook about how she's asking her fellow Democrats, because of the policies that Dave and I represent, to vote for me in this race. And I think that's the big thing. You know, Dave got into the race and I think thought it was going to be a little more sleepy and an easier walk. And I've really challenged him on what his extremist friends have said, which is that setting aside the 80,000 acres on day one is the best thing for the environment. And I don't malign his intentions. I think he wants to do the best thing for the environment. 100%. But what I'm challenging him on is the science on that. These aren't old growth, and these aren't habitat lands. These are lands that were put into the habitat conservation plan, knowing that they would be harvested over time. So the federal biologist and the state biologist put the whole plan together and said, these are the pieces that you should be harvesting. And what we know is that healthy forests can sustain through catastrophic fires, or are more resistant to disease or bug or infestation. We know that they sequester more carbon than the older forests that emit. And again, I'll reference the California cap and trade forest inventory for that. But there's also international examples of that, and national ones. That's pretty clear. And I think when you're going to lead an agency like this, you have to be able to tell even your own team no. And I have yet to he knows he would do this on day one, and he'd be in court on day two, because the Supreme Court and the state courts have affirmed that you can't just pull land out of the trust and not maintain the benefit to the people. And his plan, he was taking credit. I mentioned the Mount Baker sale, where they are, getting like a tenth of what they normally get, and they're in an active debt plan, and it's harming students. Well, he's taking credit for setting that aside. And that was part of the habitat conservation plan. It was an approved sale. He's done the same thing in Thurston County. He's done the same thing in Clallam County. The groups that are supporting him went and stood behind the trees here in Dabbler, not far from my house, talking about how we have to set this aside. And I'm like, if you're not willing to follow the science on this, and you're going to listen to extreme groups within your own team, you're going to hurt our environment, and you're going to hurt the people, the beneficiaries and the people of Washington. And that's where him and I really stray. I think you have to actively manage it, and you have to do it to high standards, and you have to do it within the federally state agreed upon plan, because that's where the science is. And here's why I think that. You have the NEPAs and the CEPAs. I mean, there are enough PhDs and scientists and biologists at DNR to start their own little university. These are not Republican extremists. They're actively looking at these lands all the time. And so when they say, gosh, this is the land that needs to have this done, this is how we support the land that's set aside, I'm going to follow that. And Dave really does want to change that. I've heard him say it several times. He thinks there are better ways to do this. And
Okay.
I guess I see it differently.
All right, thanks, Colleen.
One of the things we hear is about from folks around this area who do enjoy the outdoors a lot, hiking, etc., is people don't treat the outdoors very well. A lot of recreationists are careless, or worse, they go off trail, they cut down things, create damage, not to mention the potential with fires, etc. What more could DNR do to try to protect those recreation areas?
Such a good point. So recreation, and we know that it's 90% of all fires are human started. So, it's a very important point. So as I've talked to each of the counties where a lot of this recreation occurs, right? Skamania, Wahkiakum, Eastern Washington, there's different counties where people just love to go and recreate. I want to see recreation continue. I'm not going to lie. That's part of why we call this place home. But the biggest challenge I've heard is there aren't enough funds to even have someone policing that or enforcing rules. There are rules about what you can do, when and how, and if things are shut or things are open, and what you can take where, and whether you can go off road or not. There are very specific rules about it on federal and state lands. But they don't even have the money to enforce. You actually have to pay an FTE And I remember when Skamania was asking me for help with this, because like, we have to police the Giver Pinchot, and we don't have the money for it. And that's true. If you go up into Bellingham and around that area into the Puget Sound and Hoods Canal, like part of what this agency can do is if they're returning that revenue and they're keeping that revenue on those forests, they actually can, whether it's through money to the counties, because there are county services, it helps with police and fire. So the ability to even, it does also help with hospitals. I was thinking about a hospital district in Olympic that is like, we're done. Like, we don't know how we're gonna we're gonna last another several years because we're not seeing any of this revenue. But that money that goes back to counties helps with educational programs, and probably even just as simple as signage, but also policing, and making sure that people are obeying the rules, or that bad actors are getting caught and pulled out. You can't do that if there's no money to make sure someone's enforcing.
So you see that as a better strategy as opposed to, say, increasing permit fees or day use fees, et cetera?
I mean, so on park, so I don't have full authority over, the DNR doesn't have control over whether the parks increase fees and permits and day use. That's state parks, and those are federal parks. So that's not wouldn't be within my purview. But making sure that the counties have revenue and that we're doing our job of managing the land will at least help them on the enforcement side. DNR does have rec land, not a lot. But how the land that it does have that's supposed to be used for habitat conservation or harvest, the way that it works with the public is very important. But again, the counties in general, right? The counties are the ones who have to police whether it's working or not. They're the 911 responders, they're the fire responders, making sure that there is revenue for them to do that, which I've been being told they don't have. Like, no one's going to catch somebody who's riding a dirt bike through a sensitive habitat area. They're just going to go do it. Let alone really illegal activity that does take place. So yeah, I don't have authority whether or not we're going to raise the state parks fees, but the way that I think I can insert myself and be a part of helping, there are fees and there are things that I think, like whether the fee is, I'm not looking to make anything like a punitive fee, because there are really good folks who use, appropriately use recreational, but if we can make that more efficient and more effective and go to areas where there are shortfalls, I would totally be open to that.
Thank you.
Ben?
Jamie, what role do you see technology playing in the future of public land management?
Well, we're already seeing some of it on, so little known, like geology and mapping is also a responsibility of DNR. And like, this comes up with the OSO slide, and not the slide, but the ability to map where there are sensitive areas, where there are slide prone areas through LiDAR and radar use. That is a newer use for the agency, and I think can continue to be a benefit, especially in Western Washington. So there are technological capabilities, I think, on the firefighting side and the aerial support side. I was talking with someone today in Eastern Washington about, like, they literally are leading the nation, really the world, in the right type of aircraft, that in the right type of training, and use just as simple as using a simulator for the different types of firefighting you would do, whether it's forest, or it's, in a dry area and you're using water or you're using retardant. Just he was basically saying, I don't know if it was in the nation or in the world, they have like 4 different types of those simulators. And no one's getting trained on that. A lot of the firefighting, aerial firefighting companies are like mom and pop, and you get, you go up in a plane a few times and that's it. But the ability to have real world like experience and know how you're fighting some of these, especially knowing we're going to be doing it in sensitive areas, I think is important. Certainly on the aquaculture side, in the aquatics, we have invasive species to fight and we have native species to protect. And there is a lot of new technology with regard to, shellfish growing is a great example. We have native shellfish on the coast that you can't get anywhere else. And they are really under threat from things like green crab. So what can we arm them, whether it's those tribal peoples or those, family farmers, what can we arm them with from the department side that'll help them fight that, but also be sensitive to the environment at the same time? I think technology is going to play a big role there. And we could talk about the advances in technology on the forestry side, which are not what they were when, they were clear cutting the federal forests, kind of the slash and burn mode. I got to see it was a piece of equipment that had the lines that they used to be able to pull like a single tree off of a huge stand on the side of a mountain. And time passed, you build a whole road up there, you destroy everything, you get your one tree, and you just leave destruction in your wake. They literally could pull the one out and bring it along the lines to where they wanted to put it on another truck. So even the technological advances there, both I think are safer for people, but it's also a better, it's just an evolution in a good way to doing the work that needs to be done, but in a more environmentally sustainable way.
Right. Any other questions? Jamie, thanks for your time. Why don't you give us your final pitch and feel free to mention any notable endorsements.
Yeah, well, final pitch would be that Washington's environmental future and economic future are not mutually exclusive. They go together. And if you use the science that's coming out of the universities on the West Coast where they're dealing with these fires, or even out of the UN or the EPA, you can see that the healthy forests are the ones that sequester carbon, and that sustainable forestry can help us manage those stands and bring an economic benefit to these rural communities who these kiddos in these schools, I think, have the same right to an equal and fair education as kids in schools that are in urban areas, right? We need to make sure that we're keeping that promise. And by law, this job is set, right? I have pledged to protect the land that's been set aside. I'm not going to pull it out. I'm not going to fight to get I'm not going to fight to undo that. But the reality is, this is also, I say that because I believe it, but it's also set. Like, this is something that, it's an executive function where you're fulfilling the roles, but everything that I have talked about doing, or the processes that I have been, are ones that have been evaluated and approved by federal wildlife managers and state wildlife managers. We're not going to get off the rails here. We're not going to create new ground in it. We're going to simply stick to the plan as it is written. And there will be adjustments and improvements as technology goes forward. But by and large, we know what we need to do to create healthy forests in Washington and to return benefit to people. And I want to do that, and that's part of the reason I have been endorsed by the pulp and paper workers for Washington, or, the painters and allied trades, because they work in these communities. They know that they've been set aside, I think, by extremists on the environmental side, and it's hurt their jobs. It's hurt their ability, and they live in the communities, like they're seeing them burn. So they have a very, I think, a first stake in making sure that we're doing this well now, but we can sustain it into the future. That's part of it. If you destroy it all now, or you let it burn, they will have jobs in the future. And I'm really proud of their endorsements. The Yakima Tribe and Band of Indians and Tribal Nation has endorsed me. I'm very proud of that one. I think part of that is because of the work we've done in the past, and they know, don't just take my word for it. My door is open to working with First Nations, and you have to be early and at the table when it comes to work on public lands, because not just resource rights, but cultural rights. And I also think that, I was really pleased to earn Willie Frank's endorsement, Willie Frank III. He is former leader of the Nisqually tribe, but a lot of their focus and their passion is fish. And we haven't even talked about fish or salmon runs. But earning that was definitely a point of pride, because the goal for us, and I think it's a shared vision, is to make sure that we're helping our wild salmon runs. And though DNR isn't Fish and Wildlife, right, it doesn't set the regulatory authority, it does have a responsibility to make sure that whether it's riparian work or buffers or culvert replacement on state land is all doing the work it can, because healthy forests mean healthy watersheds. And we've worked on it down here in Southwest Washington. I'm actually really proud of what a lot of the folks are doing down here, but the Puget Sound's a mess. Salmon in the Puget Sound have like a 2% chance of surviving. And that's the food source, not just for the orca, but for native peoples. And so there's a lot of, I think, recognition that it's not mutually exclusive. We can do the work that needs to be done, and we can make sure that we're protecting some of those salmon runs. So all things said, I'm excited. I think I'm the one candidate who's prepared to start this role on day one. I have a history of collaborating, even with people from, I like groups or ideas that I don't agree with, or who don't agree with me. And I think that that's what it's going to take to really make sure that Washington's public lands are protected and sustained, and that the people of Washington benefit from them. I think we can lead the world. And so that's my pitch. I'm looking for, just say jamieforlands.com.
Great, well, thank you. Thanks for your time, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you all. I appreciate it. All right.
Thank you.
Good luck.